Losing faith, losing religion, finding faith is an apt title for our Advent reflection on these two Tuesday evenings. Tonight, we're going to focus on one writer's research of many researched documents and 7,000 interviews, more or less, that were conducted with regard to the current state of religion in America. So this evening, we focus on losing religion. And the first article of the five by Jessica Gross has the title, Lots of Americans Are Losing Their Religion. Have you? And I think it's going to be important to first understand or process some of what is meant by saying that there are a lot of people losing their religion. She begins, the author does, by giving an emblematic illustration of how things are changing or have been changing. She cites a Gothic style beauty of a Catholic church built in the 19th century by German immigrants, but how in recent years that has been turned into a skateboard park, and how many other church properties have been turned into quite beautiful condominiums. In the US, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 churches close down annually, either to be repurposed as apartments or other situations, or to simply be demolished. But the issue here that becomes important right from the beginning is it's not just the frequency of church going that's declining, but the importance of religion. A recent Wall Street Journal, University of Chicago poll surveyed 1,000 adult Americans about the importance of different values to Americans, including the importance of religion. And only 39% of the respondents said religion was very important to them, whereas in 1998, the response was 62% saying it's important. There's an important distinction, though, that needs to be made, because when we talk about the decline in religion, we're not necessarily talking about the decline in religious belief, but in the decline in organizational participation. And that's the issue at hand. In 1988, 17% of adults never attended a religious service. In 2021, the most recent tag, 31% of American adults are saying that they've never attended a religious service. So it doesn't mean that people don't believe in God or a higher power, but that they have no religion in particular. They fall into that category of the nones, N-O-N-E-S. This topic, though, is so much more complicated than the quotation phrase, Americans used to be religious and now we're not. Just the same, more and more people are becoming disaffiliated from organized religion, and not just mainline traditional churches, but the quotes newer or more quotes modern churches, the mega churches. And so it's an issue across the board with regard to American Christianity. In her second article, she begins by quoting a professor who says Christianity's got a branding problem. And that has to do with how people perceive religion rather than what they personally believe or wonder about. What is this branding problem? That people no longer attend church or ally themselves with a particular faith tradition because so many people are perceiving a political drift in their churches, cutting both ways, complaining that either their churches have become too liberal or the association of the word Christian with conservative political views has become too ubiquitous in the American landscape. So this perception of churches becoming too political becomes yet another upsetting division for people in a country which is already rife with ruptures. But political polarization isn't the only reason for the rise of the none of the above or no particular religious affiliation, which is really a catch-all term for atheists, agnostics, and those who say they have no religion in particular. Nuns went from 0 to 2% in the 1950s. Back in the 50s, if you asked the question, do you have a religious affiliation? 98 to 99% would say what church they belong to. Today, 30% of Americans say they have no particular religious affiliation. And no one single causal mechanism can account for these growing numbers, but there is some data and much speculation. And if you had a chance to read these articles, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't had a chance, I'm just going to sort of graze through them so that we can have a discussion. Following World War II and the Korean War, there was a 1950s boom for American religiosity, in part because religion represented patriotism during the Cold War against an atheistic communism. It's no accident that Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s, as well as In God We Trust starting to be printed on our money. But then you have the counterculture of the 1960s, where young people were questioning nearly every aspect of American institutions, including religion and including the American version or brand of religion. And young people questioning everything, it wasn't just questioning the religious fear, but the questions about sexuality, gender, race, war, and violence, which were raised in the 60s, was across the board and set the tone for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century so far. There was a backlash to that 1960s countercultural questioning, and it was often worked out again in political language. But at the base of it all, it just further exacerbated the fissures and fallout that was developing in society as a whole, and for the purposes of our discussion, churches in particular. In the late 1990s, with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War, religion was already becoming, but was becoming then more or less tightly connected to nationalism. Being American and being Christian were no longer seen as a hand-in-hand reality. And then you get to the 1990s and the 2000s, and there's another aftershock in that more and more youth are becoming disaffected from religion. At least that's the way Gross reports it. But really, this has more to do with the fact that these kids who are disaffected from religion are largely disaffected from religion because their parents already had been. And the parental religious affiliation was on the decline. And for their children, therefore, there was never any kind of acculturation into religious communities. And of course, the culture war issues continued and continue to this day. Other factors that have been cited for the decline of religious participation has been the internet and even the pandemic. But the question has to be raised, is the internet or the pandemic responsible for the decline, or was that decline going up in terms of numbers anyway? Other factors, the secularization theory, that when a country becomes more educated and prosperous, its citizens become less religious. They still believe in God, but they don't necessarily affiliate with a particular denomination. In the third article, Gross asks the question, why do these people lose their religion? And she goes on to explain how more than 7,000 readers shared their stories. And again, the stories of how we have more people in the none category, no particular religious affiliation. It involves a lot of different stories from younger people who have never been involved with a church to why some people moved away from the organized religion that they were a part of as they progressed through life. And through those interviews, Gross points out that there were a number of reasons for leaving the church that had to do with change in personal circumstances like birth, death, moving to a new place, taking a new job. And she cites an example of how a number of people talk about they needed that Sunday job. They needed time and a half. So they opted for the employment opportunity rather than going to church. In sharing aspects of other stories, she talks about someone who grew up in the Black church. And the quotation is, I literally grew up in the church. And this person talks about how necessary social bonds were forged through church community, that small Black church community was very important. But as the person grew up, he began to realize he never really actually believed in what Christianity was teaching, but that the community factor was what kept him in the church. But as he got older and began to see how his prayers were not being answered, he became disaffected with what religion was teaching. What kind of compassionate God would allow the level of carnage and suffering that I see in the world? It just doesn't make any sense. And this person's story goes on to say how he'd gone from the Black Christian movement to the Malcolm X Islam movement to finding himself in Zen Buddhism, but that he reached a point where really what he just wanted to do was to live an ethical life, a life of service in helping others. Another tells the story about how when she was in college, the resident advisor in her dormitory was somebody she fell madly in love with and went in his direction of religion, which happened to be InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And she got very taken up in that movement. She was, had a born again experience, and over the next couple of years was with that, but went from one Christian group to another, to eventually being in a situation where she felt very controlled and even brainwashed, and she moved away from the church because of that, yet still missed that sense of community. Another talks about how she'd been raised in a religious household, but lost her faith early in life. And Gross cites statistics that find that 62% of religiously unaffiliated Americans lost their sense of faith before they turned 18. And that an additional 28% lost their faith between the ages of 18 and 29. And to kind of make the point in an extreme sort of way, she points out how this woman talks about how she lost her faith in first grade. She found a bike in her family's storage room that she knew was a Christmas gift and realized there was no Santa Claus. My brain just went Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny, God. It took less than a minute to realize that I'm 6 years old and I'm on my own in the world. Now, to some of us, that may sound like, how can it be? That sounds a little bit traumatic. But I myself have heard stories like that from a number of people who are struggling with faith. Another talks about having been raised in a fundamentalist church. But as she started to get a little bit older, she questioned things like creationism. She says, thanks to the internet, where she was able to do more research and realizing that the world was not created in 7 days, as a literal understanding of the Bible would have it be. And she went on to say that realizing that people who believed other things weren't evil, I was encouraged to move away from the religion of my upbringing. And she too still misses the community that existed in that, even though she moved away from it. And it's not just young people who lose their faith. Quite a few readers talked about losing their faith in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. A woman named Kathy talks about how when she met her husband, she started attending his Episcopal church and she grew to love the service and the liturgy and the sense of connection, and how everyone around the world is involved in the same service at the same time, excuse me, repeating the same words. And she felt that that was very comforting and supporting while she was raising her children, helped provide a sense of moral grounding for the whole family. But then a few years ago, her husband died, and she found that at first she was drawn to go to church every Sunday just to be able to feel close to her husband, remembering what it was like. Ultimately, she realized she was going to church not to pray to God, but to be more communicating with her late spouse. And that really kind of shocked and surprised her. And during the pandemic, when she couldn't go into the church building, it gave her time to think about this. And she realized that what she had been doing as a couple was more important to him than it was to her. And that he was no longer alive in her life, and that really church going was no longer important to her. So, I, and that also is not an unusual circumstance. Another person, and this was actually a Lutheran pastor who had spent about 30 plus years in the ministry. In one parish at one time, he knew 4 people who were going through struggles with cancer. And 2 of those people lived and 2 died. They all were relatively young and had kids. And he said, I just kind of sat and thought a little bit about my doubts and questions. And it immediately became clear to me, I don't really believe this stuff. How that these things happen in life is just, as he was saying, it doesn't, I don't get answers from religion. And that was coming from a pastor. And certainly, I think we all know people who have that kind of experience. In the 4th article, she goes on to say, Gross does, that when you consider it all, the most dramatic change has been in regular attendance at worship. We're currently in the middle of the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. About 15% of American adults living today, that's about 40 million people, have effectively stopped going to church. And that this has happened in the past 25 years. It affects every demographic in the country in this trending away from worship. It's not related to an age group, an economic bracket, an ethnic or racial background. But for all of these people, many said that they did miss aspects of traditional attendance. They still believe in God or certain aspects of their previous faith traditions. And they've searched for replacements. And some people have said instead of the traditional Sunday worship, they've become more attuned to spending more time in nature, in meditation, or physical activity, basically anything that would get them out of their own heads and worries about the material world. Others are trying to forge new kinds of religious paths for themselves, drawing upon the love-rooted, justice-centered wisdom found in the Bible. One person says religion is like a language, a means of communicating with the divine. And just like that language, there are many ways of interpreting and expressing it. And then Gross goes on to point out that a number of people are finding alternative community in online communities or in non-traditional faith communities, that rather than a Christian community or a Jewish community, it's a Jewish Christian interfaith community. that people are experimenting with and finding value in. One of the main qualifications readers seem to be looking for in their new spiritual communities is something that is less exclusionary, less dogmatic. And then in the closing article, Gross, in some ways, summarizes things she's already been saying, but points out that there are still some things that churches offer that people who are not religiously affiliated still long for. And I already mentioned that, and that's community. She says that well over 2,000 of her reader responses underline community as the thing that is missed and the thing that is desired. That many left the church for strong reasons, but desperately miss this sense of community. She says, sort of in a sidebar, but important, I asked every sociologist I interviewed whether communities created around secular activities outside of houses of worship could give the same level of wraparound support that churches are able to offer. And the answer, nearly across the board from all of the sociologists, was no. And then she quotes at length Phil Zuckerman, a professor of sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College, who says, I can go play soccer on a Sunday morning and hang out with people from different races and different class backgrounds, and we can bond. But I'm not doing that with my grandparents and my grandchildren. A soccer team cannot provide spiritual solace in the face of death. It probably doesn't have a weekly charitable call, and there's no sense of connection to a heritage that goes back generations. You can get bits and pieces of these disparate qualities elsewhere, he said, but there's no one-stop shop, at least not right now. Another important point before Gross concludes is that she points out, as I've noted in the part 4 of the series, every demographic group in the United States is becoming less religious. But groups that are overrepresented among people with no religion in particular are those without high school diplomas, who are single, who don't have children, and who earn less than $50,000 a year. She points out rightfully that this particular trend complicates, if not contradicts, the commonly held notion that religion is most deeply rooted among everyday working class Americans and less among the educated higher wage earnings. This suggests that there is increasing social isolation across the board and that it is bad for all of us. Americans of all backgrounds are clearly in the midst of a profound shift away from trusting many different kinds of institutions, not just the religious ones. There's a lot of pain and alienation fueling many people's rejections of their religious upbringings. She ends on a hopeful note, hoping that this shift, which is gaining speed, will cause religious organizations to rethink what they're about and the conditions of the lives of the people they're actually trying to serve. But even having said that, when you take it all together, it's not on the face of the situation a very hope-filled picture. Now, I would start by asking anyone if there's anything they want to say off the top, but I've got 5 or 6 discussion questions to make sure there's a discussion. But I don't want to preempt initials. Go ahead, Sue.
I wonder how often she goes to shul. I mean,
not
she
all.
I would think not. I mean, this was very annoying for me to read how she categorizes everything. Religion is not the same as having faith. I think she missed that point. And where is the word faith throughout these articles? Very few and far between. She never once mentioned, how about you start believing in God's promises? Do you know what they are? Could you even list one? Everything was religion, religion, church, church. You know, for a very long time, I didn't go to church. I never stopped believing in God and believing in the promises and understanding what was written. I mean, I think she completely missed the mark. You know, I think to her, if you go to church every Sunday, that makes you religious. Well, if I sit in my car overnight, it doesn't make me a car. So it was really it just really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And then when she started reducing everything to politics, it was this group versus that group and this group. That's why people don't go and sit in a church anymore. They rather, if they have a belief in God, they're going to read the Bible themselves. They're going to seek out answers, because I don't want to hear that either when I go to church.
Mhm.
I want to hear the readings. I want the priest to explain it to me, and I want him or her to say what was going on at that time in the world and how it relates to what's going on in the world now and how I can deal with it. That's what I want to get out of it. And if you don't get it, you got to seek it out yourself. It's not a reflection on, because I'm not religious, because I wouldn't be in church. I mean, I got a lot more to say. Just as a special note, I got a real big chuckle out of the woman that said, when you mentioned that, well, when she read on the internet that the world really wasn't created in 7 days, I mean, like, I wouldn't even admit that out loud. Does this woman not understand Genesis, God's time? Do you ever hear the phrase, one day is worth 1,000 years in God's life? I mean, if you're
Well,
finding your agnosticism on the internet, then you got no hope.
so to summarize, Sue, you thought that perhaps her secular perspective caused her to miss some things that might have been very important to the topic.
Yeah, you think maybe?
Okay.
I mean, what was the last time she
Oh,
flipped
okay.
through a Bible?
Okay. Well, it's good to hear some other voices here. Herb,
Yeah, let me know when you run out. I can fill in a lot
That's
more.
okay. It's okay.
And I would say, Sue, that your response is well founded as a person who, inside of a faith community, upon reading these articles, keeps asking those questions. You know, what about the particularity of faith? And that's a word she never uses.
Nope.
There's a purpose for why she never uses it, or there's a reason for why she never uses it. And one other of you might tilt in that direction, and we'll come back to that. But that's not to discount anything you said, Sue. What about Victoria, Herb? Your initial read. Herb, you've got to come off mute.
Herb, turn you. There you go.
The growing and the grim reality is that the trend for the last 60 or 70 years has been that people have left their religion behind and the churches are empty. And they're closing down and they're being repurposed in other ways. And churches are struggling to try to find those connections that revitalize it and are able to regenerate themselves that way. And from what I can glean from the reading is that a lot of people don't have a connection or a feeling of community now that they've left the church or they're not involved in the church. And an important element of any church is to build that or try to build that connection more and more and more. But the pull of religion has been and continues to be that people leave. They just, and some people have observed it's been replaced not by, some people would say, nature or New Age spiritualism. It's been replaced by those secular interests. They're more devoted to a sports team or they're more devoted to a secular pursuit in the world that gives them a sense of purpose or belonging, or they are more attached to the material features that surround them. And the feelings towards a religious institution have disappeared.
And
So
again,
you know,
go ahead,
I find it interesting that even if you talk to the most, not the most, the word I would say is the devout Catholics, and the people that would right away say, I'm a Catholic, but then you'll find out they never go to church. They, you know, rarely, or maybe during the holidays at the very best, but that's the only affiliation that they would have. So, and that's there.
and what we have in Herb's response and Sue's response, and I don't mean to pigeonhole them in any way or to undercut what either of them said, is Herb's doing a reading of the numbers. And Sue she's not questioning the numbers. She's saying there's another way, not even another way to look at this, but from the position of a person of faith, there's a whole lot that isn't being asked in these series of essays, short essays. I think that's because the author isn't preaching or writing about why people should belong, but is reporting on the data that people give about why they don't belong. And she's just putting that out there, trying to put it out there in an objective way without taking a particular stand. Although she does admit she falls into some of the very categories of the people she's interviewing, and that sort of would be her full disclosure. Anyone else on how these articles hit you? Dan, Victoria, who'd like to go first? I'd like to hear from all of you. There's nobody behind you, Vicky. You're going to have to.
And I never talk until I hear Victoria talk first.
Okay.
Victoria, your views. Got to turn your mic on. There you go.
Yep. I thought it was an interesting article, and I thought it had a lot to think about on her perspective on why people don't go to church. And I just read them a little while ago, so I would have to think a little bit about them, and I think I would like to reread them again.
Oh. And I think rereading them after hearing what each of us see as either the takeaways or the lacking aspects of the essays would be helpful in a second read.
I tend to take probably a more long-term perspective on these things. When I say long-term, you know, Christianity may be going through a difficult time right now, but, you know, it was going through a difficult time when people were being fed to the lions. And all throughout American history, there have been these religious awakenings where the number, you know, the role of faith within our community has varied and has gone through reawakenings, various historical reawakenings. And I think that the issue, you know, as a kind of a cultural anthropologist, my perspective on this is, if you look at a society, there are certain components of every society. There's the government, there was religious institutions, there's family, and so forth. So as these institutions, in addition to religion, have changed, religion changes, you know, and the role of religion changes in that context. So I am probably less concerned and less alarmed. No, am I upset that churches are closing? Yes. But I think that some cases that's the marketplace itself, and that the religious, you know, what people are looking for out of religion and what religion is providing to people may not be a good match. And so I think that I'm not as pessimistic in terms of the trend because I do think it can reverse. But I think in order to reverse, then religion itself, an organized religion, needs to change. And an organized religion needs to be real more focused in terms of understanding, in some ways, without compromising its core tenets, what it is people are looking for in a faith community, and really being willing and humble enough to look at it and say, okay, what are we doing well? What do we need to do differently? And if we truly want to reach people and we want to get them to deepen their faith, what are the things that we can do that really make a difference? So that's my soapbox. I'm more optimistic, and I think that any church to close, you put your head in the sand and say this isn't important, and I don't have to pay attention. This is a mistake. But I think the bigger issue is that churches have to think, okay, what do I do about if we just assume everything that she said was true, what do I do about that to better connect with my own faith community and with others? So that's my 2 cents or nickel.
And in the same way, not to turn into a caricature what Dan has said, but remembering what growth opens up with, that what immigrant German community of the 1800s and that beautiful Gothic church. If you've got a church that is ministering to immigrant Germans in the late 1800s, but still acts like they're ministering to immigrant Germans in the year 2000, when Germans don't even live in the community anymore, let alone no longer see themselves as immigrants, that's part of the reason why that particular church is closed. And to focus on the closing of churches in and of itself as the canary in the coal mine might be a little bit off, in the sense that a church can close because it no longer is serving the purpose it once served. And things are much more organic than brick and mortar. And that people get served in new ways. And there are ways to where the church has changed and grown. And that's why some of these properties are being sold off, because they're not needed anymore. So, depending on what the reader's attachment to, just in this limited sense, to church buildings is, you could be like, oh my God, or you can be, well, it doesn't make sense anymore. So there are changes that have to be made. And what are those changes? There are many. Bishop Provenzano is forever reminding people wherever he goes that it's not the number of people in the pew that matters. It's the people in the pew that matters. What is that particular faith community's understanding of mission, and how are they seeding the good news in the larger community? Whether that's 5 people, 55 people, or 550 people sitting in the pew. You can get into a numbers thing about religion that starts to miss the point about faith. As Sue was saying, I don't hear faith anywhere in these articles, and that's intentional on the reader's part, because she's reporting out on a phenomenon and is leaving to the reader, okay, how are people of faith going to respond to these statistical realities? Anybody on a second round of comments? Sue?
Well, she left out faith, but she also left out the importance of knowing why you should have faith. Because this is just the launching pad to our eternal life. And that just doesn't get said much anymore. That we
Well,
don't.
a lot of people don't believe this.
Well, that's part of the faith.
Yeah,
is
but a lot of
believing
people
that there
don't.
is an eternal life after this.
But a lot
That's
of people don't believe that. They
Yeah.
don't believe there is an eternal life.
Well, because they're not reading the Bible. I mean, that's where it all comes from. That's what Jesus taught about his kingdom, unless I'm missing something. So people don't get it because their parents don't get it. So they don't teach it to the kids. So then the kids don't go. They don't seek out any answers by trying to learn about what was Jesus trying to say. So they just go there and they just, punch their clock, and then they leave, and they don't try to find out, well, what did that mean? Why is it important to receive the sacraments? There's not enough of that. People don't, there's no magic in prayer. Prayer is not magic. It's not meant to be magic. It's meant to be comforting, a connection to God. And people miss that. Dan, I'm sure you even remember when our niece April converted to Catholicism. After she got baptized, one of the first things she said was, I don't feel any different. What do you think what was going to happen? You think an angel was going to come down and bop you on the nose or something like that?
That would be nice.
It would be nice, but it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And she wasn't classically taught why it was important. And she came to it later in life. That's why, when you talk about World War II, there was this big boom because those were the guys who were saying there's no agnostics in the foxhole, because when you're scared enough, where do you turn? You turn to God, because when there's nothing else left, that's where most people go. At least the people that I know that found themselves in the throes of life that throws them curveballs, because Jesus always said it wasn't going to be a cakewalk. And this is how you're going to get through it. You're going to learn to lean on me and learn to lean on prayer. And, I don't know if she's writing the next set of articles that show the good news. Maybe she'll bring it up then, but I kept reading these and kept saying, well, where's the good stuff? And it just never materialized. And, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to go by that. The internet said that the earth was created in a lot longer than 7 days. Well, gee, wow. If I had to
And
turn to the
that is
internet.
a facile comment that she writes there. I think she's doing shorthand in that
Was it tongue in cheek?
people
I don't know.
maybe not, maybe tongue in cheek in the sense of a little bit snarky, but there are folks in religious communities who have kind of clawed their way out of those communities because their thought processes have been highly controlled. And you've got lots of people, including the Speaker of the House, and I know that starts venturing on political, who says the universe is only 5,000 years old. And he calls
That's when you
himself
turn,
a
that's when you
religious.
turn to the Bible. You don't believe politics. You go to the Bible and figure it out from there. You can't, go by these people that say these things.
Well, I know,
It's
but what I'm saying, Sue, is that some
simplistic.
people use the Bible as their grounding for saying the world is only 5,000 years old. And
Mm.
I'm not even saying that as a way to get into a debate about the misuse of the Bible, but just to point out that some of the reasons people disaffiliate from religion is because of the heavy-handed way in which it was presented to them in the first place.
Yeah, that's a pity. That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, they're the hardest ones to reel back in, I would think.
And then there are loads of people who were never involved in the church and know nothing about it really, and don't know what to make of it. And that leaves us, I think, as faith community, what do we do to reach those people? And I'm not trying to get into problem solving at this point. And next week, when we look at those 3 songs in Luke, that's when, I raise the question, and that'll be your homework. How do Mary, Zechariah, and Simeon offer clues for finding faith at a time people are giving up on religion? And in Jessica Gross's defense, she's not writing about faith. She's writing about religious decline.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's two very
And she
different
does
things.
point out what she means by religious decline is people not going to church, not affiliating with a religious community in a deep sense or on a regular basis. And that is
Very
an
obvious.
issue, right?
Mhm.
We could say, and any priest in any parish could say, and any parishioner could say, we have people we don't see but Christmas and Easter.
Yeah, the twofers.
And how, not judging the extent to which their attendance, their attendance twice a year might infuse them with the Holy Spirit in ways we'll never know. But in terms of building community and sharing community, it doesn't exactly happen. And so for me, the two takeaways for me, one was a data point, and that is because for years and years it's being said that the reason for religious decline in America is prosperity and highly educated people saying they don't need religion. And the data shows that lots of Americans, even more Americans who are not prospering and are not highly educated, are also leaving religious institutions. So it's not, I don't think it's a prosperity issue. I think it's more existential and crucial than that.
Yeah, I think it's hip not to be religious. I think a lot of people think that, oh yeah, I know, yeah, like I love when a person says, there's no God. Really? Really? So in other words, you understand every single thing about the universe, everything, because you would have to know everything to know that there is not this one thing. That's the only way you can prove that there's no God. You have to know everything. And quite frankly, I don't think they do.
I think a lot of them don't think they know everything. They think they know the church is not the place to find anything. Except, and this is my second takeaway for me, this whole thing about community and the importance of community, which I believe is very important. But I think back on my own religious experience, and it cuts in two directions. The first thing I'm going to say is there was no religious community in the church of my childhood and youth. I was in a Catholic parish with thousands of people. The closest thing to community was getting out of the parking lot after the mass. And yet, at the same time, in my Catholic high school, there was a deep sense of community. And if anything, it was my experience in Catholic high school that kept me thinking there's something to church. Because my parish experience was get away from this as fast as you can. It's a big
But then
ball.
you went out and you sought to get answers, I assume. Yeah, and that's my point. These people just say, nope, that's it. I'm not even going to bother to look for it. And that's the pity.
Also, not to get off on a tangent here, but one of the things that resonated with me as I read the 5 articles was the kids who lost their faith because their parents never really emphasized it. And we all see that. Father Tom, you must have seen that over and over and over again with, get the kid done for baptism. It's like the emphasis on getting the kid done as opposed to there being a faith life. I see it within my own family, and we know Ashley, my niece Ashley, who we all love dearly, is going through a tough time with her husband and, with brain cancer and stuff. But, the reality is those kids were baptized at All Souls, and they very rarely came because it wasn't important. It just wasn't important. I love them and I'll always be there for them. They're always welcome there. But just, even before Mark got sick, it just wasn't a priority. It just wasn't important. And that's very different than I think most of us on this call, how we were raised. But when someone lapses away from the church and then comes back to the church, just because someone lapsed away doesn't mean that they can't come back. If they come back and make the sense of community and get a reawakening of their own spirituality and being a member of a community. So the fact that someone lapses or comes away from church in no way, manner, shape, or form precludes them coming back. And I've lost count of the number of people that I've encountered with over the last several years through the things that we've been doing, when saying, you know, the way I feel here and the way you treat me and the way you interact with me is so different than what I experienced when I was turned away. And that's what I think is the ultimate thing that each of us is called to do, and each faith community has to do, is how do we engage people? How do we reach out to them? How do we connect with them? How do we, to quote an expression, you know, how do we meet them on wherever they are on their spiritual path? That's where I think churches are missing.
Yeah. And I think that these articles, that what Groza is trying to do is to point out where a lot of people are, where statistically more and more people are, and that religious communities, people of faith, need to be aware of the situation in life of all these people, in thinking about, as Dan just said, how do you meaningfully reach out to people? And I think it's important because when we do Bible study, one of the questions we ask is, okay, Jesus is speaking, people are responding. What were the conditions? What were the living conditions at the time? What were people's situation in life? And I think, I mean, the reason I put these articles up for us to be talking about is because it gives a snapshot based on statistics, and I would even say, you know, anecdotal storytelling. Where are people? Where are a lot of the people who aren't a part of religious community in America these days? And I think she does a good job of showing that. And next week, what we can do is say, okay, let's listen to these 3 songs early in Luke, and how does the Song of Mary, the Song of Zechariah, and the Song of Simeon begin to move in the direction of saying, this is what faith is about, and how can this be presented to people who don't affiliate with a religious community? Because that, in effect, is what the mission of the church is. How do you share the story of faith with people who are not in the community of faith? And we can see if those songs help us. So for next week, read the first 2 chapters of Luke. Those 3 songs are just, you know, embedded in the first 2 chapters. They're not very long at all, neither are the first 2 chapters. And let's have that conversation.
Well, I don't think she was writing her article on whether people have faith or not. She was writing on whether people attend church or not, and maybe why they don't, but not on her faith. And I think we bring people into the church by living our faith. When we come in contact with everyday people, how we treat them, how we act. I think there's a lot of instances where you say something or compliment somebody and they really appreciate it. Today we were at tea at the Arboretum, and there's this waitress there, which we met her before. She's really a nice person. She's really a good waitress, and she makes the tea, you know, a really positive experience. So we went up to the gift shop and we bought her just a little thing. She really freaked out over it. We bought her just a little thank you, because she's really such a nice person. And I think when you go out to eat or when you go shopping, especially if you're going out socially, the people that are waitresses and whatever can make or break your experience in a restaurant. And when you run into a waitress or wait staff that are really nice, it really makes it a pleasant experience. And I think if you treat people the same way that you're treated when you run into these nice people, it sort of maybe it will encourage people to, you know, rethink faith and religion and interaction with other adults.
Lead by example.
Yeah.
I think that's Victoria, thank you. That's a good place for us to end this evening and begin next Tuesday.
Okay.
Yes,
Meanwhile,
wanna
see you
say,
this coming Sunday.
I'm sorry I seem squirmy. I had an injection in my hip today and I can't get comfortable.
So
What Sunday? Is there anything special on Sunday I missed?
no, I just
Every Sunday is special,
every
Victoria.
special, yeah, every Sunday is special. Come on,
So
Victoria, you
it
know
was
that.
Luke 1 and 2, Song of Mary, and what's the Simeon reading?
The Song of the Nunc Dimittis.
Now we-
You're good. It's
Yeah.
in the email where I described and I'll send it out again.
Okay.
In
If you
fact-
read the first two chapters, you'll cover all three.
We
Oh,
did,
great.
we did Song of Zechariah today at morning prayer. And we'll do probably Song of Mary next week. So you'll have 2 of the 3 under your belt. So, okay, Father Tom, anything else?
No, that'll do it for this evening. Good to see you all and have a
Sure.
good night and a
Thank
perfect.
you.
And this will be recorded.